The morning Adelaide Garrison walked into the sheriff's office in Dusty Creek, Texas. With mud on her boots and fire in her dark eyes, Deputy Orville Sutton had been half asleep with his boots propped on the desk and a cold cup of coffee going stale beside him. And by the time she left, he was already half in love with her, though he would not have admitted it under any form of lawful questioning. It was the spring of 1882, and Dusty Creek sat stubborn as a briar patch in the middle of the Texas Panhandle, a town of perhaps 400 souls squeezed between a rail line and a river that flooded every April without apology. The streets were wide and brown and full of horse traffic. The saloon on Main was already doing brisk business before noon, and the sheriff's office smelled permanently of tobacco and old leather, and just a little bit of justice, which was the only kind of cologne Orville Sutton had ever needed. He was 29 years old, lean and tall in the way of men who spend most of their time on horseback rather than at supper tables, with dark brown hair that curled a little at his collar and pale gray eyes that had seen enough of the world to be careful and enough of the good parts to still be warm. He had been a deputy in Dusty Creek for 3 years, filling in for Sheriff Harlan Briggs, who was technically present but practically absent, spending most of his energy on political matters, poker games, and nursing a bum knee that had never healed right after a horse threw him back in '79. Orville did not mind. He liked the work. He liked the early mornings when the town was quiet and the sky turned a slow orange over the flat horizon, liked the conversations with the ranchers who came in with their complaints, liked the feeling of order that he could sometimes impose on a landscape that was still sorting itself out. The war between cattlemen and settlers was cooling down some, but there were still men who thought the law was an inconvenience rather than a protection, and Orville had made it his personal mission to persuade them otherwise. He was mid-persuasion by way of a nap when the door opened. He heard the boot heels first, quick and purposeful. Not the shuffle of someone uncertain about why they had come, not the heavy drag of someone coming in drunk, but the firm, deliberate strike of someone who had made up their mind and was not prepared to unmake it. He swung his boots off the desk and sat up straight, and Adelaide Garrison was already 3 steps into the room. She was perhaps 26 or 27, medium height, with dark hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat that had seen considerable weather, and she wore a plain brown dress with a canvas work apron still tied over it, as if she had been in the middle of something when she decided she could not wait another moment. Her face was sharp-featured and handsome rather than conventionally pretty, with cheekbones you could navigate by and a jaw that suggested she had grown up having to mean what she said. Her eyes were brown, almost black, and at that particular moment they were furious. "I need to speak with the sheriff," she said. "Sheriff Briggs is indisposed at present," Orville said, standing up and reaching for his hat out of old habit. "I'm Deputy Sutton. I'll do my best." She looked at him with the evaluating expression of a woman who had learned to assess quickly and trust slowly. Whatever she saw must have been at least passable because she came further into the room and stopped in front of the desk. "My name is Adelaide Garrison," she said. "I have a farm about 4 miles east of town on the Creek Road. My husband passed 8 months ago consumption, and I have been working the property since with my daughter and 2 hired hands. 3 days ago, someone came in the night and stole my seed grain." Orville reached for the leather-bound incident ledger on the desk. All of it. Every last sack. Her voice did not waver, but something in her jaw tightened just slightly. "I had 40 bushels of spring wheat seed stored in the second barn. It was everything I had set aside for planting. Without it I cannot put in a crop. Without a crop I cannot meet the bank note due in September. Without meeting the bank note," she stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. "I need that seed back, Deputy, or I need someone to help me understand what to do." Orville was writing in the ledger, but he was listening to more than the facts. He was listening to the way she had stopped herself in the middle of that sentence, the way she had reined herself in from saying the words that came after. He recognized that particular kind of discipline. It was the kind a person built up over months of very hard circumstances, brick by careful brick, because if you let yourself say the worst thing out loud it became more real. Were there any tracks, he asked. Signs of how they got in? The latch on the barn door was cut clean, she said. Someone used a good knife. The tracks in the soft ground by the door looked like at least 2 horses, maybe 3. They came in from the north side of the property, through the draw. Tracked them yourself. I was raised in New Mexico territory, she said, with a look that suggested she found the question slightly redundant. My father ran cattle, I know tracks. Did they go far, the tracks, before they crossed hard ground? They headed northeast and I followed them about half a mile before the ground firmed up and I lost them. There is a limestone shelf that starts about there and you don't get impressions in limestone. She paused. I know who it was. Orville looked up from the ledger. Who? I believe it was Clem Dovers and his brother Roy. They have a camp about 8 miles northeast of my property, up in the breaks. Everyone in town knows they are trouble. They have been asking around about distressed properties, farms that might be struggling, and I have heard from the widow Harker that Roy Dovers came to her place last fall when she was behind on her taxes and made her a very low offer for her seed stock. She refused and the seed disappeared 2 weeks later. That's a serious accusation. I am a serious woman. She did not say it with anger. She said it like a simple statement of established fact. I am not here because I am emotional or confused. I tracked what I could track. I thought about who I know in this area, and I came to the most logical conclusion available to me. I want that seed back before the 2nd week of April because after that the planting window closes and it does not matter anymore. Orville closed the ledger and stood up. Do you have anyone out at the property right now? My daughter Clara, she is 11, and my hired hand, a man named Sam Teague who I trust. She hesitated. My other hand left last month, said the work was too uncertain. Orville nodded. He could hear what she was not quite saying. The property was vulnerable. She was stretched thin, and the clock was already running. Mrs. Garrison, he said, I am going to look into this. I want you to go home and not do anything about the Dovers brothers on your own. Can you do that? Something flickered in her expression that was not quite amusement but was adjacent to it. I was not planning to confront them myself, Deputy. I am not foolish. I came to you precisely because I understand the limits of what I can do alone. Good. He picked up his hat from the nail by the door. I'll come out to your property this afternoon to look at the barn and the tracks, and tonight I am going to ride up into the breaks and do some investigating. She studied him for a moment. Just you, not the sheriff. Sheriff Briggs has some physical limitations that make nighttime riding in rough country difficult, Orville said carefully. She seemed to understand that too. She was a woman who had developed a very sophisticated talent for reading what people meant when they said things carefully. All right, she said. I will expect you this afternoon then. She turned toward the door, then stopped, turned back. Deputy Sutton, if you find that seed and return it, I want you to know that I am not a woman who forgets a good deed. I'm not doing it for gratitude, Mrs. Garrison, he said. I know, she said. That is why I mentioned it. And then she was gone, those boot heels clicking back out into the bright, dusty morning, and Orville stood in the doorway watching her go, and thought that he had never met a woman quite so completely herself, and that this was a fact that was going to occupy a considerable amount of his mental real estate in the hours ahead whether he invited it to or not. He went to the sheriff's quarters behind the office and knocked. Briggs, I have a situation. The voice that came back was thick with sleep and mild irritation. Handle it, Orville. Already am, he said. He went back to the desk, checked his Colt, shrugged on his coat, and began to think about the breaks northeast of Dusty Creek and what a man with bad intentions might do with 40 bushels of spring wheat seed. The Garrison farm was not what he expected, which was to say it was better. It sat on a gentle rise above the creek with a good view in 3 directions, 2 solid barns of weathered timber, a low stone house that had been built to last rather than merely to occupy, a kitchen garden that showed the careful tending of someone who took pride in what they grew, and 4 solid-looking horses in the paddock. It was a farm that had been built with intention. Someone had put real work and real love into this land. The fact that a family could lose it over a single bad growing season, a single theft, a single piece of bad luck, Orville felt the familiar low anger that he had come to associate with the gap between the law on paper and justice in practice. Adelaide was waiting for him by the barn. She had changed from the work apron into a clean dress, still plain, still brown, but the kind of clean that suggested she had taken the time despite having approximately no time to spare. He appreciated that without being quite sure why, except that it was consistent with the picture he was forming of her. A woman who maintained standards even when the circumstances were trying to grind those standards down. Her daughter Clara was nearby, a serious-faced child with her mother's dark hair, and something of her father's look that Orville could not quite name except that it was a look of quiet watchfulness, like someone who had seen enough change to know that you did not stop paying attention just because things seemed calm at the moment. "Deputy Sutton," Adelaide said, "thank you for coming." "I said I would," he replied, dismounting and looping his reins over the paddock fence. "Show me the barn." She showed him the barn. The cut on the latch was clean, exactly as she had described, the work of a sharp blade wielded with confidence. Inside, the floor still held the drag marks of heavy sacks being moved out. 3 trips at least, maybe 4, 2 or 3 men working together. The way the marks layered over each other told a story about the order of operations, and Orville crouched over them for a long time reading what he could read. "You were right about the tracks outside," he said when they went back into the daylight. He followed her around to the north side of the barn, where the soft ground near the draw still held the impressions of hoofprints, and he crouched down beside them and spent a good while going over them carefully. 2 horses, as she had said, maybe 3. One set of prints was smudged and overlapping in a way that could mean 2 horses or 1 horse that had stood and shifted. He made note of the shape of the shoes and one particular print that showed a slightly turned-off rear shoe on one of the animals. "You have a good eye," he said, standing up. "Most people would not have caught the distinction between 2 and 3. "I told you," she said simply. He walked the track with her as far as it went, to the limestone shelf where the ground firmed and went smooth and gave nothing. He looked northeast across the rolling country, the broken cedar-covered ridges in the distance, the draws and gullies threading between them. He had been up in those breaks a time or 2 over the years on other business. He knew the country well enough to navigate it at night, which was something he was planning to do. "I know where Clem Dover's camps," he told her as they walked back toward the house. "He and Roy have been using a place up in the breaks for about 2 years. They run cattle that may or may not be entirely theirs, and they sell things that may or may not be entirely available for selling. I have not had enough hard evidence to do much about it until now." Adelaide Garrison stopped walking. "And now?" she asked. "Now I have your testimony, I have those tracks, and I have a turned-off shoe on one of those horses to look for. If I find it, I have probable cause to recover the stolen property and bring charges." He paused. "If I find it." "You will find it," she said. It was not flattery. It was not wishful thinking. She said it like a woman who had looked at something carefully and rendered a verdict. "I'll do my best," he said. She looked at him for a moment in the warm afternoon light, and something in her expression softened just slightly, like a door not quite open but not quite closed either. "Will you stay for supper?" she asked. "It will not be much, but it is something. And it is a long ride back before you head out again." He almost said no from habit, from the kind of professional distance that had become second nature to him. But the late sun was warm, and the kitchen garden smelled of things coming back to life after winter. And the look on her face was not pity or gratitude, but something more complicated and more interesting, and he said yes. Supper was cornbread and salt pork and dried beans cooked with a little onion, served at a sturdy table in the stone house with Clara sitting across from him watching him with those dark watchful eyes, and the hired man Sam Teague at the far end. a weathered, quiet man of about 50 who had clearly decided Orville was acceptable before he sat down, and did not revisit the question once. Adelaide sat at the head of the table without any particular self-consciousness about it, serving portions and asking questions with the ease of a woman comfortable in her own house, which Orville found quietly admirable because he knew how hard it was to be comfortable in your own house when that house was also your greatest source of anxiety. She asked him about himself, naturally and without pressure, the way a person asks when they are genuinely curious rather than making conversation. Where was he from? How long had he been in Dusty Creek? Did he have family nearby? He told her he had grown up in Kansas near Wichita. His father had been a blacksmith, and his mother had taught school until she died when he was 12. He had come to Texas in 1876 after a few years working on cattle drives out of Abilene, had ended up in Dusty Creek after a conversation with a departing deputy who had told him the town needed a steady hand and the job was open. "And the work suits you?" she asked. "Better than driving cattle," he said. "Though some days the cattle were better company than some of the people I deal with." Clara laughed at that, a quick surprised sound like something that had gotten out before she could stop it, and she immediately looked down at her plate as if she had committed some minor embarrassment, and Orville smiled at her. "You do not have to hide a laugh," he said. "It is the best sound in any room it is in." Clara looked up at him with something that was almost, not quite, a real smile. It was close enough. After supper, as the light went amber and long outside the window, Adelaide walked him out to his horse. The evening was quiet except for the creek and the horses and the calling of something distant and unseen. "Be careful tonight," she said. She said it simply, without theatrical worry, but with a directness that suggested she meant it precisely and specifically. "I am always careful," he said. "I believe that," she said. "I am saying it anyway." He mounted up and looked down at her in the amber light, and she was looking back at him with those dark, serious eyes, and the moment stretched out just a beat longer than it strictly needed to before he touched the brim of his hat and turned his horse and rode. He did not look back. He was almost certain she watched him go. The ride back to Dusty Creek was short. He stopped at the office long enough to leave a note for Sheriff Briggs explaining where he was going and why, to check his rifle and his saddlebags, to eat a biscuit left over from the morning, and to fill his canteen. It was full dark by the time he rode out again, northeast, with a good moon rising, and the familiar Texas sky scattered with more stars than seemed strictly necessary for navigation. He had ridden these breaks before, and he rode them carefully, not rushing, letting his horse set the pace on the dark ground, reading the landscape by moonlight the way a man learns to read it over years in the saddle. The cedar-covered ridges were black shapes against the sky, and the draws between them were darker pockets of shadow, and the night smelled of cedar and dry grass and the ghost of water somewhere. He knew roughly where the Dovers' camp was, up behind the second ridge in a pocket where a seep spring made permanent water, and the cedar was thick enough to hide horses and men from casual observation. He came at it from the south, which was the long way, not the direct approach from the trail, because the direct approach was the kind of thing that got a man shot at before he had time to introduce himself. He hobbled his horse a quarter-mile out in a good screened draw and went the rest of the way on foot. The camp was where he remembered it. He could smell the wood smoke first, and then the horse smell, and then the low murmur of voices. He came through the cedar on his belly for the last 50 yards, and from behind a good-sized limestone outcrop, he looked down into the hollow where Clem and Roy Dovers had made their housekeeping. There were 2 men by a small fire. He recognized Clem Dovers from prior encounters. A large, dark-browed man of perhaps 40 with the kind of permanent squint that comes from spending decades reading bad intentions in other people's faces. Roy was younger and lighter built, with a nervous energy about him that expressed itself in constant small movements, picking up things and putting them down, shifting his weight, turning his cup. What interested Orville considerably more than the men were the horses. 4 of them, picketed in the cedar beyond the fire. He studied them as carefully as the light allowed. 3 of the horses were animals he had seen the Dover's brothers riding in town on various occasions. The 4th was a compact bay he did not recognize, and when he studied its stance and the way it held its rear left hoof, he felt something settle solid in his chest. Turned off rear shoe. He worked his way around the camp, still on his belly, still quiet, and found what he was looking for stacked under a cedar lean-to on the east side of the hollow. Burlap sacks, 40 of them by rough count, stacked in 2 rough rows. Some of them had been opened and resealed. He got close enough to confirm what was in them. Wheat seed, just exactly the kind a small farm on the creek road would have had stored for spring planting. He lay in the cedar and thought about his options. He was one man. They were 2. He had surprise and the law on his side. They had a defensible camp and no immediate reason to believe they had been found. He thought about this for a good while, listening to the murmur of their conversation, which was mundane and concerned mostly with whether there was enough coffee and the relative stupidity of a cattle buyer named Henderson who had apparently lowballed them on a recent transaction. The thing Orville settled on was the thing he had settled on in similar situations before: patience and timing. He waited until both men were clearly asleep, which took the better part of 2 hours, and then he moved. He got the 4 horses first, unfastening the pickets as quietly as he could manage, and walking them one at a time back up into the cedar, and around the long way to where his own horse was hobbled. He had brought lead ropes enough for 4 animals. He worked slowly, and did not hurry because hurry was the mother of noise and noise was the mother of waking people up. Then he went back for the sacks. 40 burlap sacks of wheat seed were not a light load. He made 4 trips, carrying 10 sacks at a time in a canvas tarp rigged as a drag, pulling it slow and quiet across the cedar duff, stopping every time a night bird called or the wind shifted, and hauling it around to the draw. His back was complaining significantly by the 3rd trip and outright furious by the 4th. He loaded as much as he could in reasonable balance on the 4 captured horses, tying the sacks with the lead ropes, redistributing weight with the careful attention of a man who had packed horses in the dark before, and knew exactly how quickly a poorly balanced load could become a disaster. By the time he was done, the moon had moved considerably across the sky, and the air had gone cold in the way it did in the Texas Panhandle at 3 in the morning, that particular dry, bone-deep cold that made you understand why people wore coats until June. He mounted his own horse and took the lead ropes of the 4 captured animals and rode south through the cedar and out of the breaks, and by the time the first gray light was coming up in the east, he was on the creek road heading for the Garrison farm with 4 horses carrying 40 bushels of spring wheat seed and a back that was never going to fully forgive him. He could have gone to the sheriff's office first. He could have done a lot of things first. He went to the Garrison farm first because the window for planting was closing, and Adelaide Garrison had looked at him in the amber light and told him to be careful, and he was not prepared to make her wait any longer than necessary for either piece of news. He arrived as the sun was coming up for real, painting the farm in that clean gold morning light that made even tired things look hopeful. He rode into the yard with the 4 horses in train, and Sam Teague was already up and at the water trough, and stopped dead still at the sight of him. Then the door of the stone house opened and Adelaide came out, and she stopped on the step, and she looked at the horses and the sacks and then at him, and he watched something move across her face that he had no precise name for except that it was large and complicated and she was clearly working hard to contain it. "You found it," she said. "All 40 bushels," he said. "I counted them twice." She came down off the step and walked toward him and then past him to the horses, checking the sacks with quick, sure hands, opening 2 of them and looking inside, running her fingers through the grain. He dismounted and stood watching her, and his back was in full rebellion and he did not care at all. "How?" she asked, turning back to him. "Clem Dover's had your seed in his camp northeast of the 2nd Ridge," he said. "I confirmed it was yours by the tracks and the turned shoe. I retrieved the property and the animals used to steal it." She looked at the 4 horses. "Are those theirs?" "They are now." He paused. "Evidence in a theft. I will need to take them in and log them, and I expect the Dover's brothers will either come into town to make a complaint, in which case I will arrest them, or they will think better of it and move on, in which case good riddance." "Will they come here?" "When they find out. I have made sure there are enough signs at their camp that they know they were visited by the law," he said. "I left my badge impression in the soft ground by their fire. Men like Clem Dovers do not go looking for more trouble with a deputy who came into their camp in the dark and took everything without waking them up. They know what that means." She looked at him steadily. "What does it mean?" "That I could have done considerably more than take the seed," he said. A pause. She understood him precisely. "Come inside," she said. "I am going to make you coffee and breakfast, and you are going to sit down before you fall down, because you look like a man who has been crawling through cedar all night." "I do feel like one," he admitted. She almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, but it was the nearest thing to one he had seen from her, and it did something pleasant and alarming to his chest. In the kitchen, with Clara still asleep and Sam and his other responsibilities outside, Adelaide made strong coffee and fried eggs and biscuits with the efficiency of a woman who had been cooking for a household alone for 8 months, and had perfected the art of making something good out of what was available. Orville sat at the table and tried to look like a man who had not spent the night in a state of prolonged physical misery, and was largely successful except that she caught him shifting his weight carefully and said, without looking up from the stove, "How badly does your back hurt?" "Medically speaking, I believe it is still attached to the rest of me," he said. "That is not what I asked." "Considerably," he admitted. "I have some liniment," she said, "for the horses, but it would work." He looked at her. She did not look at him, but the corner of her mouth was doing something. "I will be fine," he said. "I know you will be," she said. "The offer stands." She set the coffee in front of him, and their hands were briefly close together on the table, and neither of them acknowledged it, but neither of them moved away quickly either. And the morning light coming in the kitchen window made the ordinary room look something like a painting of the kind of life a person might have if they were lucky. They talked over breakfast. Properly this time, without the formal purpose of a report, without the professional distance of a first meeting. She told him about her husband Franklin, about the farm they had built together, about the years in New Mexico before they came to Texas. Franklin Garrison had been a good man, she said, a hard-working, careful man who had built this farm with his hands and his savings and his belief that honest labor in good land would produce a good life. And it had, until the consumption took him in the autumn of 1881, quietly, and with a cruelty that was all the worse for being invisible, a slow fading rather than the sudden violence that took so many men in this country. "Clara does not talk about him much," Adelaide said, looking at her coffee cup. "But she keeps his watch in her pocket every day. She never winds it, she just carries it." Orville was quiet for a moment. He thought about that watch, stopped at whatever time it had stopped, carried in a child's pocket across the prairie every single day. "You have done a remarkable job holding this together," he said. He said it straight, without embellishment, because she was the kind of woman who would find embellishment insulting. She looked up at him. "I have done the job I had to do," she said. "There was no remarkable about it. There was just the doing." "That is what remarkable looks like, mostly," he said. "From the outside." She looked at him for a long moment with those dark eyes that seemed to assess at a considerable depth, and then she said, "You are not what I expected when I walked into that office yesterday." "What did you expect?" "A man like Briggs," she said, half present, half interested, nodding and writing things in ledgers and doing very little. "That is an accurate description of some of what I do," he said. "No," she said, "it is not." The moment held between them, warm and specific, like the morning light itself. Orville was aware that he was sitting in a widow's kitchen at sunrise after spending the night retrieving her stolen seed, and that this was not, strictly speaking, standard protocol for a deputy sheriff, and also that he could not think of anywhere on earth he would rather be. He left before Clara woke up, because propriety was a real consideration in a small town in 1882, and he was conscious of Adelaide's reputation, which belonged to her, and not to him to manage. She walked him out to his horse again, this time in the bright morning instead of the amber evening, and the difference in the light made everything feel more vivid, more present. "I'll file the report today," he said, unhitching his horse. "I want you to come into town this afternoon and give a formal statement. That will strengthen the case if the Dovers brothers push back." "I will be there," she said. He mounted up, looked down at her. She was looking back at him in the clear morning light, and her face was not the controlled, tight, careful face she had brought into the sheriff's office the day before. It was something more open, something that had room in it, and he recognized that because it was the same thing he could feel happening in his own chest, a kind of making room for something new. "Adelaide," he said, and then stopped. Because he had not planned to use her name and was not sure he had the right to yet, she did not correct him. She just looked up at him with those dark eyes. "Thank you," he said, "for the coffee." It was not what he had meant to say, but it was enough for the moment. She nodded once. "Ride careful, Orville," she said, using his name back at him like a quiet and deliberate act. He rode careful. He presented himself at the sheriff's office and told Briggs the whole story, and Briggs, to his credit, was less irritated and more impressed than Orville had expected. "You went alone into the breaks after the Dovers boys," Briggs said flatly. "I did. In the dark. The moon was good." Briggs was quiet for a moment. "You are either brave or foolish, Orville." "Most likely both," Orville said. "But the widow Garrison has her seed back, and the Dovers brothers have lost their horses and their nerve, so I consider it a reasonable exchange." He logged everything, filed the papers, sent a message to the county sheriff in Amarillo, explaining the situation and requesting that a warrant be prepared for Clem and Roy Dovers should they present themselves for any reason. Then he went and slept for 4 hours on the cot in the back room with his boots on, because he was too tired to take them off. He woke to someone knocking on the office door and found Adelaide Garrison on the other side of it, Clara beside her, both in their good clothes, come to give the formal statement. He made coffee again and sat across the desk from her, and wrote down everything she said carefully and officially. And the whole time he was writing, he was aware of her in the way that a man is aware of a fire in a cold room, its warmth a physical fact you cannot entirely ignore. Clara sat in the corner of the office with her mother's basket in her lap, looking at everything with those solemn dark eyes. At one point she got up and went to look at the wanted posters on the wall, studying each one with the careful attention she seemed to bring to everything, and Orville watched her do it and felt something paternal and unfamiliar stir in him. "She is like you," he said quietly to Adelaide when Clara was absorbed in the posters. "How do you mean?" "Careful," he said. "Takes things seriously, does not waste attention." Adelaide looked at her daughter. Something in her face was very tender. "She is more like her father in some ways," she said quietly. "He was the patient one. I am the one who goes to the sheriff's office." "I am glad you did," he said, and meant it enough that it came out quieter than he intended, and she heard the difference in it and went still for just a moment before she looked back down at the paper in front of her and said, "What else do you need for the statement?" He told her what else he needed for the statement. When they were leaving, Clara paused at the door and looked up at him with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to moderate directness. "Are you going to make sure they do not come back?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "That is exactly what I am going to do." Clara considered this. "Good," she said, and went out into the afternoon with her mother's hand in hers. Adelaide was last to leave, and she paused at the door the same way her daughter had, and it occurred to Orville that this was not a coincidence. "Sunday," she said. "I'm making a proper dinner. Would you come?" He said yes before he was fully aware of having decided to. She smiled, a real one this time, brief and bright and genuine, there and gone like a match struck in a dark room, but he caught it and held it in his memory with the careful hands of a man who intends to keep something. The Sunday dinner was the first of several. By the second Sunday, Orville was making the ride east on the creek road with the ease and pleasure of a man going somewhere that matters to him. And by the third, Clara had begun saving him the seat beside the window that looked out over the paddock, which was her seat, which Orville understood to be an enormous concession. The planting happened. The wheat went in on the right side of the window, and the rains were decent that spring, not generous, but decent, which was all you could ask from the Texas panhandle, and sometimes more than you got. Orville rode out on his days off to help with the heavier work, learning the rhythms of the farm in a way that was both practical and personal, learning the way Adelaide moved through her land and her work, the particular quality of her efficiency, the moments when the controlled competence gave way to something more unguarded, when she was in the kitchen garden in the early morning, or when she watched Clara ride the old bay mare in the paddock, or occasionally when they were talking after supper and the evening had gone easy, and the conversation found its own way without effort. She was funny, which surprised him and also did not surprise him. The same quick, precise intelligence she brought to tracking hoofprints and maintaining a farm and navigating the county bank note applied itself to the world with a dry wit that emerged mostly when she was comfortable and only when she trusted you. And Orville found himself working fairly assiduously to be the kind of company that brought it out. She had come to Texas from New Mexico Territory with Franklin in 1877. She told him, 3 years into their marriage, because the land there had gone complicated in ways that were not getting less complicated. The Lincoln County troubles were starting, the range wars between the big operators and the small ones, and Franklin had decided that he would rather build something new than fight for something uncertain. She had agreed with him, she said, though she had left behind her father and her younger brother and the land she had grown up on, and she did not speak of this without a kind of sorrow that she carried carefully. "Do you hear from your father?" Orville asked one evening. "He passed 2 years ago," she said. "My brother Daniel is still out there. He writes when he remembers to write, which is not often. He is 20 and a cowboy, and cowboys of 20 have considerable faith in their own immortality and limited interest in correspondence. I remember being 20, Orville said. Were you insufferable? Spectacularly, he said, and she laughed, a real laugh, unreserved, and the kitchen felt like the warmest room he had ever been in. The Dovers brothers did not come back to Dusty Creek. The county warrant was filed in Amarillo, and 2 months later Orville received word through the county sheriff that Clem Dovers had been picked up in the Palo Duro Canyon area on charges of cattle theft, and Roy Dovers had apparently crossed into New Mexico territory and made himself someone else's problem. The threat to the Garrison farm from that quarter was closed. The threat from the bank note remained. Adelaide told him about it plainly one Sunday in late May, the same way she told him everything directly, without asking for rescue, just sharing information with someone she trusted. The September note was due, $340, and she had been making slow progress toward it from selling butter and eggs and the small stand of cattle she had maintained. But the crop was not in yet, and the cattle were not sold yet, and it was going to be close. Very close. "What does the bank manager say?" Orville asked. "Patterson is a reasonable man," she said, "within the limits of what reasonable means to a bank manager, which are narrower than what it means to most other people. He has given me until the end of September, which is a 2-week extension from the original date. I believe he will not extend further. The wheat is looking good," he said. He had ridden the fields with her the week before, and the spring wheat was coming along in a way that made a practical man feel cautiously hopeful. "It is looking good," she agreed. "I need it to keep looking good for another 2 months." Orville was quiet for a moment. He was thinking about several things at once, which was a habit of his that occasionally got him in trouble when what he was thinking arrived as words before he was fully prepared for it. "Adelaide," he said. She looked at him across the supper table. "I want to be honest with you," he said. About something that is not strictly my business to be honest about, except that I believe you know it already, and I think we are both of the kind that prefers things said plainly." She was very still. She had a quality of stillness that was unlike most people's stillness. Most people's stillness was absence of motion. Hers was presence of attention. "I think about you," he said. "Not about the farm, and not about the case, and not about Sunday dinners. I think about you. I have been thinking about you since the morning you walked into the office with mud on your boots and told me you were a serious woman." He paused. "I am 39 years old, and I have managed to avoid this particular situation without too much difficulty my entire life, and I do not experience the current inability to continue avoiding it as a problem. I experience it as—" He stopped, looked at his coffee cup, looked back up at her. "Something I would like to know more about." She looked at him for a long time, long enough that the lamp on the table had time to flicker once, twice, and settle. "I was 24 when I married Franklin," she said finally. "I do not regret a single day of it. He was a good man, and I loved him, and I still miss him in the particular way that you miss someone who has been inside your daily life so long that their absence feels like a rearrangement of furniture that you keep walking into in the dark." She paused. "I also know that grief is not the same thing as duty, and missing someone is not the same thing as being closed to the world." She looked at him steadily. "I am not closed to the world, Orville. I have not been closed to the world for some time now. I have been waiting for something that felt worth opening toward." The lamp flickered again. "And," he said quietly, "you rode out alone in the dark and came back with everything," she said. "On the basis of my word and a set of hoofprints and a turned-off shoe." She held his gaze. "That tells me a considerable amount about the kind of man you are." He reached across the table and she put her hand in his, and they sat like that in the lamplight kitchen of the stone house on the creek road, while the evening outside was full of spring frogs and a soft wind, and neither of them said anything for a while, because nothing needed to be said. Clara came downstairs for water and stopped in the doorway and looked at them with those serious dark eyes, and looked at their joined hands, and then looked up at Orville with an expression that a man of less practical intelligence than he possessed might have missed. It was not a happy look. It was not an unhappy look. It was the look of a child doing very rapid and complex internal calculations. "I am getting some water," she said, and went to the pitcher and got her water and went back upstairs, and Orville and Adelaide both watched her go. "She is all right," Adelaide said quietly. "She just needs time." "I know," Orville said. "There is no hurry." But the time that passed after that was not the slow, uncertain time of people who are not sure where they stand. It was the fast, sure time of people who know exactly where they stand and are moving towards something together with both feet, which is a different thing entirely and moves at a considerably different pace. He came to the farm more often. Not just Sundays, but evenings in the week when his duties allowed, and sometimes whole days when there was fence to be mended or the second barn roof needed attention, or simply because the farm was 8 miles from town, and the ride each way was time spent outside in good country on a good horse, which was never wasted time. He became useful to the farm in a way that was organic rather than deliberate, his skills and hers fitting together the way two pieces of work fit when they have been made with the same quality of attention. And he got to know Clara. This was not a fast process. Clara Garrison was 10 going on 40 in some respects, and she had a very clear sense of what she was entitled to be cautious about, and a man who was spending a great deal of time with her mother fell squarely within that category. Orville did not push it. He was present, he was consistent. He did not talk down to her or perform an enthusiasm for her company that was not genuine, and he did not try to occupy the place that belonged to her father. He was just himself, which was all he knew how to be, and he let her decide. The deciding took about 6 weeks, and it came in the form of a question she asked him one afternoon while he was mending the paddock fence, and she was sitting on the top rail watching him work. "Do you know how to play chess?" She asked. "My mother taught me," he said. I am not exceptional at it, but I am not embarrassing either. Papa taught me, she said. I have not had anyone to play with since he got sick. I would be glad to play with you, he said. She looked at him with those measuring eyes. You will not let me win, she said. I do not want to be let win. I want to actually play. Clara, he said, I promise you on my deputy's badge that I will play you as hard as I know how. She nodded, satisfied, and hopped off the fence and went back to the house, and that was that. The chess games became a weekly event, and she was better at it than he had expected. And twice she genuinely beat him in ways he could not have predicted, and those were two of the best moments he had in the whole summer of 1882. The crop came in well. Not triumphantly, but well, better than close, better than the worst case, better than the worry of May. The rain stayed kind through June, the fields turned gold in July, and the harvest in August was strong enough that when Orville rode out on the first day of it with Sam Teague and 2 other men Adelaide had hired for the week, the sight of the wheat standing full and heavy in the morning light made his chest feel something large and uncomplicated. Adelaide ran the harvest with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything, directing and working simultaneously, her face flushed, and her hair coming loose from its pins in the August heat. And at one point in the long hot afternoon, Orville looked up from the work to find her looking at him from across the field with an expression that was entirely unguarded and entirely clear. And he held the gaze for just a moment before they both went back to work, smiling. September came and the bank note was met. Adelaide came into town and paid it in full at the counter of the First Bank of Dusty Creek with Mr. Patterson watching from behind his spectacles, and Orville happened to be on the boardwalk outside when she came out, because she had told him when she was going and he had made sure to be in that part of town at that time, and she stopped on the bank steps and looked at him. "Done," she said. "Done," he agreed. She came down the steps and they stood together on the boardwalk in the September sunshine, and she put her hand briefly on his arm. And that was a public gesture in 1882 on a main street, and she knew it, and she did it anyway. He took her to supper that evening at the boarding house on 3rd Street, which served the best food in Dusty Creek that was not someone's personal kitchen, and they sat across from each other with the formality of a first supper date in a public establishment, and without any of the uncertainty of people who do not know where they stand, and talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing, and Orville thought he had not been so completely happy in a very long time. Which was a thought that sat strange and good in a man who had spent most of his adult life finding contentment in the smaller forms: a good horse, a clear morning, the satisfaction of work done right. He asked her to marry him in October, on a Tuesday evening, in the kitchen of the stone house, which was exactly the right place. He had been thinking about how to do it for approximately 3 weeks, and had rejected several approaches before arriving at the conclusion that the right approach was the honest one, undecorated, which was the approach that fit both of them best. He told her that he had come to believe that whatever life he had been building up to this point had been building toward something specific, and that specific thing was the life that included her, and Clara, and the farm on the creek road, and the Sunday dinners, and the chess games, and the full, complicated, honest, real partnership of 2 capable people who were better together than they were apart. He said that he was not asking her to be rescued or maintained or protected, because she was fully capable of her own rescuing and maintaining and protecting, and had demonstrated this thoroughly. He was asking her to let him be beside her for the rest of it, because beside her was where he most wanted to be in the world. Adelaide Garrison looked at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight and said, "Yes, obviously yes. What took you so long?" He laughed. She laughed. And then she got up and came around the table, and he stood up and she put her hands on either side of his face, and looked at him in the lamp light with those dark, serious eyes gone soft and certain. And he kissed her for the first time in the warm kitchen of the house she had built her life in, and it was the most natural thing either of them had done in a very long time. They were married in November, in the small church on the edge of Dusty Creek, by the Reverend Thompson, who was nearly 80 and had been marrying people in this county since before it was a county. It was a small wedding because Adelaide preferred small things done well to large things done averagely, which Orville had come to understand was one of the organizing principles of her character. Clara stood beside her mother in a new dress of dark blue wool, her father's stopped watch in her pocket as always, and her expression throughout the ceremony was one of careful watchfulness that gradually, very gradually, moved toward something more open. When the Reverend pronounced them married and Orville looked down at Adelaide and she looked back at him with that rare and brilliant smile, Clara made a small sound that might have been a laugh and might have been something else and reached out and took her mother's hand, and Adelaide took it and squeezed it and did not let go. They had a wedding dinner at the Stone House with a handful of friends and neighbors, Sam Teague and his wife, a couple of the women from Adelaide's church circle, Sheriff Briggs, who ate 2 plates of everything and fell asleep in the corner chair and snored gently through the apple cake, and a few of Orville's colleagues who toasted him loudly and were gently encouraged to leave at a reasonable hour by Adelaide, who managed the transition with such diplomatic smoothness that they were all on their horses and heading back to town before any of them fully realized they had been organized. Orville moved to the farm. This was the obvious arrangement, and it was not discussed with any particular drama. The deputy's position had him in town certain days of the week and on call for emergencies, but the farm needed a body present more than the boarding house did. And besides, the farm was his home now, which was a fact that settled into him with the quiet solidity of things that have been true for some time and are finally being named. The first winter of their marriage was a good one, meaning that it was hard the way winters in the Texas Panhandle are always hard, with cold that had a personal quality about it and wind that found every gap in the south-facing walls. But it was hard in the companionable way of difficulty shared rather than endured alone. They were together in the house in the evenings with the stove going and the lamp on the table and Clara doing her lessons and Orville reading the Amarillo newspaper, 3 days late with his boots off, and Adelaide mending or writing letters, or occasionally just sitting quietly with a cup of tea. And the quiet itself had a quality in it that was the opposite of loneliness. He still wore the badge. He still rode into town on his assigned days and dealt with the disputes and the thefts and the occasional drunk cowboys from the surrounding ranches who decided that the saloon on Main was the appropriate venue for any grievance they happened to be nursing. He was good at the job and he knew it and he liked it, and Adelaide never once suggested he should stop doing it, because she understood that a man who is good at something important does not stop doing it without losing a piece of himself, and she was not in the business of taking pieces of anyone. Spring of 1883 came with more rain than the previous year, and the planting went in well and on time, and in April Adelaide told him, quietly and directly in the way she did everything, that she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen in the morning, with the breakfast things still on the table and Clara's boot steps audible upstairs, and she watched his face with those careful eyes to see how he would take it. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and kissed her with a thoroughness that made her laugh into his mouth. "I take it you are pleased," she said. "Adelaide," he said, "I am so pleased that I am going to have to go outside and do something physical immediately, or I will not know what to do with myself." She was laughing when he went outside, and he stood in the April morning with the new grass coming green in the meadow and the wheat barely up and the horses moving peaceful in the paddock, and he looked at the sky with its early light and felt something large and grateful move through him. He told Clara after breakfast, because Adelaide said he should be the one to tell her, which he understood to be a statement of something important about how Adelaide saw the 3 of them together. Clara listened to him with her characteristic seriousness, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands in her lap, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment and then she said, Is it going to be a boy or a girl? I don't know yet, he said. We will not know for some months. She considered this. I would like a brother, she said. He looked at her, this serious child with her father's watch in her pocket and her mother's eyes and her own particular fierce, careful heart. I'll see what I can do, he said. She almost smiled. You cannot do anything about it, she said, with a precision that was pure Adelaide. No, he agreed. I really cannot. The summer passed in the fullness of a good year, good crops, good weather by the relative standards of the Panhandle, good health, good work. Adelaide's brother Daniel came to visit in July, arriving from New Mexico territory on a horse that looked like it had covered a great deal of ground with limited care. A lean young man of 20 with Adelaide's dark coloring, and a restless quality about him that was the complete opposite of his sister's still precision. He stayed 3 weeks, and Orville liked him immediately for the frank, unguarded way he spoke and the obvious love he had for Adelaide. And Daniel looked at the farm and the house and Orville and the way Adelaide was in her life and said to Orville one evening when they were on the porch, "She is happy." "I believe she is," Orville said. "She was happy before," Daniel said. "With Franklin. But that was a different kind of happy. That was a happy that she made work. This is a happy that just seems to," he searched for the word, "fit." Orville was quiet for a moment. "I am glad," he said. "You better be," Daniel said without heat, just the simple directness of a young man who loves his sister and is telling you so in the only language he has. Daniel went back to New Mexico at the end of July with a new horse, because the old one had not been treated right, and Adelaide had declared it was not going back to whatever that life was, and a set of saddlebags that Adelaide had packed, and that Orville suspected, contained a great deal more food than Daniel had asked for. They watched him ride south, and Adelaide stood beside Orville on the porch step, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned against him in the morning light, and said nothing, and he said nothing, and both of them understood this to be a complete sentence. The baby arrived in November, just over a year after their wedding, delivered by the midwife Mrs. Calloway, who had been bringing children into Dusty Creek for the better part of 2 decades, and had a calm professional manner that Adelaide found immediately reassuring. Orville was allowed to be present by Adelaide's clear and non-negotiable instruction, and he stood in the corner of the bedroom where he had been told to stand, useful and useless simultaneously in the way of men in these moments. And when the sound of a new person arrived in the room, he did not entirely trust himself to be as stoic as he generally managed to appear. It was a boy, strong and indignant and extremely vocal about the indignity of the whole situation. They named him Franklin James Sutton, the Franklin for the man who had built the farm and loved Adelaide and was Clara's father and deserved to be remembered forward, and the James for Orville's father who had stood at his anvil in Kansas and taught his son that a man was measured by what he built and maintained rather than by what he claimed. Clara held her brother that first evening with an expression of concentrated ferocity that was the most maternal thing Orville had ever seen from a child, and she looked up at Adelaide and said, "He is very small." "He will not stay that way," Adelaide said. "Good," Clara said. "He will be much more interesting when he is larger." Orville looked at Adelaide over their daughter's head, and Adelaide looked back at him, and they shared a look that had no name but contained every good thing. And the lamp burned warm, and the baby made his feelings known again, and the stone house on the creek road held them all in its solid walls against the November cold. The years that followed were the good kind, which did not mean they were easy, because no years in the Texas Panhandle in the 1880s were easy, but they were good in the full sense of the word, which is to say they were full of substance and meaning, and the specific pleasures of a life built with your hands and your heart and the people who matter most to you. Orville remained the deputy of Dusty Creek through the decade, and his reputation in the surrounding counties grew in the quiet way of men who do their jobs well without requiring anyone to notice. He dealt with the disputes and the difficulties and the occasional genuine violence that the frontier still produced, And he came home at the end of those days to the farm and the supper table and the ongoing chess war with Clara, who got better and better, until the matches were genuinely balanced affairs that went deep into the evenings and produced considerable satisfaction for both participants. Sheriff Briggs retired in 1885, announcing at the 4th of July celebration that his knee was not going to put up with any more of this nonsense, and the county commissioners held an election, and Orville won it by a margin that could charitably be described as overwhelming. The badge that passed from Briggs's hand to his on the steps of the sheriff's office was the same badge he had been wearing as a deputy for 3 years, slightly different in shape but not in substance. Adelaide attended the swearing-in with Franklin on her hip, now 2 years old and extremely interested in hats, and Clara at her side in her good dress. And when they pinned the star to Orville's chest, she was looking at him with that expression he had come to know best of all her expressions, the one that lived somewhere between pride and affection and something more private. And he looked back at her and felt the ground solid under his feet in a way that had nothing to do with the earth. There was an incident with a cattle baron named Whitmore in the summer of 1886 that deserves mentioning because it showed something of who they were together. Whitmore had been buying up land on the eastern edge of Dusty Creek County through methods that were legally ambiguous and practically brutal, leveraging debt and water rights in ways that squeezed small farms until they had no choice but to sell or collapse. 3 families had already sold under duress, and 2 more were in difficulty. Adelaide brought the matter to Orville's attention, having talked to each of the affected families herself, having gone to them in the practical, straightforward way she had of meeting a problem directly, and she laid out the case with a clarity and detail that he matched against his own legal knowledge and found to be both accurate and actionable. "This is not illegal on its face," he said, going through the documents she had collected. "Buying land is not illegal, but the threats to the water rights, those cross lines. Then those are the lines to cross back over," she said. He did, carefully, by the book, working with the county attorney in Amarillo to file complaints and then to bring the matter before the county judge. It took 6 months and a great deal of patience and paperwork, and one genuinely tense confrontation between Orville and Whitmore's hired men in the middle of Main Street that Orville handled with a precise economy of words, and the kind of calm that convinces men that the person in front of them is not going to be the one to back down. Whitmore left Dusty Creek County in the spring of 1887. The affected families stayed. 2 of them sent gifts to the farm on the creek road, a smoked ham from one, a bolt of good fabric from another, and Adelaide accepted both with the grace of a woman who understands that gratitude is a gift the giver needs to give, and that refusing it is the discourtesy rather than the virtue. "You know," Orville said one evening, as he was going over the last of the Whitmore correspondence, "when I was riding up into the breaks that night to get your seed back, it occurred to me that I was doing it partly because it was my job and partly because you were the most interesting person who had walked into that office in years, and I wanted to have a reason to see you again." Adelaide looked up from her mending. "Only partly because of the job," she said. "Significantly partly," he said. "Well," she said with that small, precise smile, "as motivations go, I consider it acceptable." "Thank you," he said dryly. "You are very welcome," she said, and went back to her mending, and he watched her in the lamplight with the full feeling in his chest that he had come to understand was just what contentment felt like when it was genuine rather than arranged. Franklin, by the age of 5, was a terror of imagination and energy who required constant supervision by everyone in his orbit, and gave that supervision back in the form of a laugh that started somewhere in the middle of him, and came out larger than seemed physically possible for a person his size. He had Orville's gray eyes and Adelaide's dark hair, and a personality that appeared to have been assembled from the most energetic parts of each of his parents and both grandparents, and possibly some additional source that remained unidentified. Clara, at 16, had grown into a young woman who was recognizably her mother's daughter in every important way, sharp and self-contained and privately warm. A first-rate student whose teacher at the Dusty Creek School had written Adelaide a letter saying that Clara should have more education than the town could offer and asking whether the family had considered sending her east. The letter caused a considerable amount of quiet discussion between Orville and Adelaide over several evenings, the kind of discussion that was not a disagreement but was a careful mutual examination of a large decision. "It would cost money," Adelaide said. "We have money," Orville said. He had been careful with money his whole adult life, and the farm had had 3 good years running, and his salary as sheriff was better than his deputy's salary had been. "She might not want to go," Adelaide said. "Then she will say so," he said. "She is not a person who has difficulty saying so." They presented it to Clara, carefully and honestly, as an opportunity rather than a directive, and Clara sat with it for 2 days and came back and said she wanted to go, but she wanted to come home for summers, and she wanted it understood that she intended to come back to Dusty Creek eventually. "Why would you come back?" Adelaide asked, not testing but genuinely curious. "Because this is where home is," Clara said, with the certainty of someone who has thought about this thoroughly and is not interested in reconsidering. So Clara went east to a school in San Antonio in the fall of 1887, and the house on the Creek Road was quieter in a way that took some adjustment, and Adelaide wrote to her every week, and Clara wrote back twice a month, and Orville found himself reading the letters too, not because he was invited to, but because Adelaide handed them to him across the supper table with the ease of someone sharing something that belongs to both of them. A second pregnancy announced itself in the spring of 1888, and Adelaide was characteristically direct about it. "This one feels different," she said. "I think it is a girl." It was a girl, born in October of 1888, small and observant from the moment she arrived, with a quality of quiet attention that was immediately familiar. They named her Margaret Ruth Sutton Margaret for Adelaide's mother, who had died when Adelaide was young, and was spoken of with a gentle reverence that told you everything about how that absence had shaped her, and Ruth after the neighbor woman in New Mexico who had helped raise Adelaide after her mother was gone, and who, Adelaide said, was the most decent person she had ever known outside of her own household. Franklin, who had wanted a brother with some enthusiasm, examined Margaret in her mother's arms with a critical 5-year-old eye, and then announced that she was all right, I suppose, and thereafter became her most dedicated protector in the manner of children who decide their affections without fully understanding them. The farm continued to do well. The town continued to grow, slowly, steadily, in the way that towns on rail lines grow when the rest of the country is extending itself westward, and Dusty Creek by 1889 had a proper school, a proper doctor who had come from back east and stayed, a new church built of stone, a bank that was now managed by someone considerably more flexible than Patterson, and the general sense of a place finding its permanent form. Orville served as sheriff through 3 elections, each one less contested than the last, because the county had come to understand that what they had in him was not a politician but an officer, and those were different things, and the second kind was rarer and worth keeping. He was offered a position in Amarillo in 1890 that would have paid considerably more and required him to move, and he declined it in 1 sentence, and then came home, and did not mention it to Adelaide until she asked him directly why the county attorney had looked at him with such a particular expression at the courthouse last week. He told her about the offer and the decline, and she looked at him for a long moment. "You did not want to go?" she asked. "I did not want to go," he said. "You should have told me before you declined," she said. "I would have wanted to know." "You are right," he said. "I should have. I am sorry." She considered him. "What did you tell him when you declined?" "That I had everything I needed where I was," he said. She looked at him in the kitchen in the morning with the coffee between them and the sound of Franklin doing something with considerable energy upstairs, and Margaret in her cradle near the stove. And her face went through several things before it settled on what it settled on, which was the same expression she had worn on that long-ago evening in the lamplight when he had told her he thought about her. That open toward something look. "You are a very good man, Orville Sutton," she said. "I am a man with good sense," he said, "which is mostly what I am." "That is the same thing," she said, and poured more coffee. Clara came home from San Antonio that same summer, 20 years old and brilliant, and changed in the specific way of young people who have been somewhere and done something and found themselves in the process. And she sat at the kitchen table the first evening and ate everything on her plate, and told them about her studies and her friends, and the city with the energy of someone who has been waiting to tell this particular audience this particular story for a long time. Franklin, 10 years old and deeply impressed by his older sister, sat with his chin in his hand and listened with an attention he rarely brought to anything that was not directly exciting. And Margaret, just past 2, climbed into Clara's lap at some point during the evening and went asleep there. And Clara held her sister with the careful tenderness of someone who has not been home for 9 months and is aware of everything she missed. Later, when the children were in bed and Adelaide was washing the supper things, Clara sat at the kitchen table and looked at Orville with her mother's direct, evaluating look. "She is happy," she said, which was almost exactly what Daniel had said years before on the porch. "I believe so," Orville said. "I was worried when you two were first." She paused, choosing her words with her usual care. "I was worried that it would be like something was being replaced, like someone was trying to fill a space that had a specific shape." Orville was quiet, listening. "But it is not like that," Clara said. "It is more like the shape of things changed and became bigger, and what you added is not filling something up. It is just there." She seemed to find this slightly embarrassing to say, which made it clearly true. "I want you to know that I am glad, for her, for you. For Franklin and Margaret." A pause. "For me." Orville looked at this young woman who had carried her father's watch in her pocket for years and played chess with fierce competitive joy, and gone to a city she had never seen and come home knowing her own mind, and he felt something warm and fatherly move through him that had no name but was entirely right. "Thank you, Clara," he said. She nodded briskly and got up and refilled her coffee and began helping Adelaide with the dishes, and that was that. The last piece of old business came to a quiet close in the fall of 1891. Orville received word from the county sheriff in Amarillo that Clem Dovers had died in the Huntsville State Prison, where he had been serving time for the cattle theft charge, and Roy Dovers had settled somewhere in the New Mexico territory, and seemed to have found legitimate work and a wife, and was generally understood to be no longer a person of interest. The case was officially closed. The stolen seed had been returned 9 years before and had grown into more seasons of crops than anyone could easily count, into a farm that was standing strong and paid off and producing, into a life that had weight and substance and joy in it. Adelaide read the letter when Orville brought it home, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she folded it carefully and set it on the table, and she said, "I thought about that night many times, that first winter alone. What would happen if they came back? Whether the farm was worth defending." "Was it?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "It always was," she said. "I just did not always believe I could defend it alone." She paused. "I did not have to." He reached across the table. She put her hand in his, as she had on that long-ago lamplight evening, and held it with the comfortable certainty of a long marriage and a full life. "No," he said, "you did not." The decade of the 1890s was the decade of settling. Not settling in the diminished sense, not settling for less, but settling into place the way a well-built house settles into its foundation, finding its final form, becoming what it was always going to be. The farm prospered consistently, not spectacularly but solidly, the way of enterprises built on honest work and careful management. The family grew in the ways that families do. Clara went back to San Antonio and eventually to a school in Austin, returning each summer and bringing books and ideas, and the particular vivid quality of a young mind encountering the world. And in 1895, at 28, she brought home with her a quiet, serious young man named Henry Worth, who was a teacher, and who looked at Clara with an expression that Orville recognized immediately and entirely. He was a good man. That was the first and most important thing, and Adelaide had established it within 20 minutes of meeting him in the way she established all important things, by asking him direct questions and listening to how he answered them. He had good sense and quiet humor and a genuine respect for Clara's intelligence that expressed itself not in condescension, but in engagement, and Franklin, 15 and suspicious of all strangers on principle, eventually admitted over chess that he supposed Henry was all right. Clara married Henry Worth in the church on the edge of Dusty Creek in the spring of 1896, in a ceremony that felt very familiar to Orville in the best possible way, and she wore a dress that Adelaide had sewn from the fabric that the widow Harker had sent years ago as a gift of gratitude, which Adelaide had kept for exactly this occasion without ever mentioning it until she brought it out. And when Orville understood what it was, he had to be quiet for a moment before he could say anything about it. "You kept it all this time," he said. "Of course I did," she said. "I knew what it was for." Franklin, at 17, had grown into a young man who was the physical combination of both his parents and the spiritual combination of neither, which is to say, he had his own distinct character that was entirely his, impulsive where his mother was measured, loud where his father was quiet, enormously warm and enormously exasperating in equal measure, and possessed of a love for the land that ran deeper than either parent had fully anticipated. He had no interest in going east. He wanted the farm, had always wanted the farm, and he had the natural talent for it that skips a generation sometimes and arrives fully formed. Orville sat with him one autumn evening when Franklin was 16 and they were checking the winter-ready state of the second barn, and Orville said, "Your mother built this farm, you understand that?" "I know," Franklin said, "and your father built it with her, Franklin Garrison. He is in this barn and in this land and in the fact that it exists at all." Franklin was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet he only had when something mattered to him enough to slow him down. "Mama talks about him sometimes," he said. "At night, when she thinks I am asleep, she goes out on the porch and talks quiet to herself about him." Orville had known this. He had always known this, and he had never made it a cause for anything except the quiet respect it deserved. "Do you mind," Franklin asked him, "that she does that?" "No," Orville said. "He was her husband and your sister's father, and he built the thing we all live in. He deserves every thought she gives him." Franklin looked at him. "You are not jealous?" "No," Orville said. "I am grateful. What he built and what she kept gave me everything I have." Franklin turned this over in his mind for a long moment, and then he nodded, once, the way he nodded when he decided something was true. "All right," he said, and went back to checking the barn, and that was all that needed to be said. Margaret the younger was in many ways the fusion of everything the family had become. She had Orville's patient gray eyes, and Adelaide's dark hair, and Franklin Garrison's name in her middle name, and Clara's books on her shelves, and Franklin Sutton's laugh in her own laugh, and the stone house, and the farm and the creek road in her bones, the way that the place you are born into lives in the body as much as the mind. She was 13 in 1901, when Dusty Creek got an electric telegraph line extended from Amarillo, which struck her as the most extraordinary thing that had happened in the county since creation, and she spent an entire dinner telling her family about everything she intended to learn about it. And Adelaide and Orville sat at either end of the table watching her, with the particular pleasure of parents who recognize their own child's specific genius. Orville retired from the sheriff's office in 1902, after 17 years of service to Dusty Creek County, at the age of 49, in full health, and with no particular pressure to go, except that the work had begun to feel complete in some way he could not fully articulate, and that there was a farm 4 miles east of town that had been waiting 20 years for his full attention. He handed the badge to the new sheriff, a capable young man of 32 named Carter who had been his deputy for 3 years and was exactly the right person for it. And he walked out of the office into the October morning and rode home. Adelaide was in the kitchen garden when he arrived, the October light catching her hair, still dark though laced now with silver, the same purposeful hands, the same steady way she had in all things. She looked up when she heard him, and something changed in her face when she saw that he was home in the middle of a day and the badge was not on his chest. "You actually did it," she said. "I told you I was going to," he said, dismounting. "I know," she said. "I still was not entirely sure until this moment." He tied his horse and came to the garden gate and looked at her across the low fence, and she looked back at him, and they were both in their middle years with the lines of weather and laughter and a few hard seasons on their faces, and the farm was all around them in its good October quietness, and he said, "What would you like to do first?" She considered this with her characteristic seriousness. "There is a section of the east fence that needs attention," she said. "Then let us see to the east fence," he said. She smiled at him, that real smile, unchanged in 20 years from the first time he had seen it, brief and bright and entirely genuine, and went to hang up her garden gloves, and he went to get his tools, and they worked together in the October sun until the fence was done, and then they went inside for coffee, and the afternoon was their own. They had years left. Good years. Franklin ran the farm with a competence that exceeded both his parents' hopes, and a charm that kept the neighboring farms in a state of friendly cooperation that was good for everyone. He married at 24, a strong-minded woman named Josephine Rail, whose family had ranched in the area for a generation, and the first grandchild, a boy they named Thomas, arrived in 1904 and was immediately claimed by both grandmothers and his Aunt Margaret as primarily theirs, which caused no small amount of good-natured argument. Clara and Henry settled in Austin, where Henry taught school and Clara eventually, quietly, and with a determination that Orville recognized from her mother, began writing for a newspaper, articles about the women of the frontier that were, he thought, some of the finest pieces of writing he had ever read. She sent them copies, and Adelaide read each one with a careful expression that was pride and something more private, and one evening she said to Orville, "She writes about me in some of them, not by name, but I can tell." "What does she say?" he asked. "That the women who built this country did not get enough of the story," Adelaide said. "That the real work was often invisible, and the real courage was the kind that is sustained over years rather than spent in a single moment." Orville was quiet for a moment. "She is right," he said. "I know," Adelaide said, "but it is different hearing it from her." He reached over and took her hand, and she held it, and the lamp was warm on the table, and the house was quiet with the evening sounds of a household at rest, and outside the Texas stars were doing their excessive best over the flat and stubborn land that had made them and kept them and would hold them both when the time came. Adelaide Garrison Sutton lived to 73, strong and clear-minded and entirely herself until the last, dying in the spring of 1929 in the stone house that she had built with her first husband and kept with her own determination, and filled with her second husband and their family. The stone house that had started as a widowed woman's desperate grip on what she had worked for, and had become one of the surest and most beloved homes in Dusty Creek County. She died in the bed she shared with Orville, on a morning in May when the light coming through the window was the same gold it had always been, and she held his hand and looked at him with those dark eyes that had assessed and trusted and loved him for 47 years, and she said, in her plain, direct way, "It was a very good life." "Yes," he agreed. "It was." He held her hand while the morning moved across the room, and he kept holding it after she was gone, and the house around him held the weight of everything they had made in it. The children grown and scattered and beloved, the grandchildren who carried pieces of both of them in their faces and their ways, the farm outside the window still producing, still standing, still the thing she had refused to let go of on the morning she had walked into a sheriff's office with mud on her boots and fire in her dark eyes and said, I need that seed back before the window closes." He was 76 that year, older than he had expected to be, more grateful than he had words for. He sat with her through the morning, and in the afternoon Clara came, and Franklin and Margaret with her husband. And the house was full again with the people it had made. And Orville sat at the head of the table that had been her table, and looked at all of them and thought of a Tuesday evening in October when he had sat in a sheriff's office going half asleep, and the door had opened, and a woman had come in who was entirely, completely herself, and the world had changed. He lived 4 more years, in the stone house, tended by Franklin and Josephine, and visited endlessly by grandchildren who grew up hearing the story of the widow who walked into the sheriff's office, and the deputy who rode out that night and came back with everything, and who understood, as they grew older, that what he had come back with was not only the 40 bushels of wheat seed, but the beginning of the most important thing in either of their lives. On his last evening in the spring of 1933, at the age of 80, surrounded by 3 generations of the family that had grown from that October morning in the sheriff's office, Orville Sutton looked out the window of the stone house at the farm in the evening light, and saw it exactly as it was: good ground, well worked, full of the honest effort of people who had loved it, and felt, in the place where contentment lives when it has been earned over decades of faithful labor and genuine love. A complete and lasting peace. The wheat was coming in the east field, the fence was holding, the creek was running clear. And over the flat horizon, the Texas sky was doing its spectacular, unnecessary best, all orange and rose and gold, the same sky it had always been, indifferent and glorious, the same sky under which he had once ridden north into the dark breaks on a horse with a full moon overhead and a woman's words in his ears: "Be careful, Orville," she had said, and had come back, as he always came back, with everything.